Start your day with It's the Business. Here's Phil Dobbie.
Yes, good morning. It is Wednesday, the 10th of February, 2021, and today it's largely about debt on the programme, and with a budget just a few weeks away, why Rishi Sunak shouldn't be quick to push up taxes to try and reduce the budget deficit.
We are borrowing to keep an economy in a state of suspended animation. And all of the underlying evidence from the labour market, from businesses, suggests that, yes, of course, there's some damage. This is a huge economic shock. But by and large, the underlying economy is being kept in a decent state of health, which means once we lift the lockdown, we can end the emergency spending, the borrowing will fall, and the economy will, in a way, sort of spring back to life.
Kallum Pickering will be joining me soon. We'll also look at Matt Hancock's latest lockdown measures. Up to 10 years in jail if you falsely claim which country you're returning from. Is the government in panic mode? Much. Oh, and for the cultured amongst us, a bit of poetry from former poet laureate John Betjeman. That'll do, won't it?
And now, it's the business. Making sense of it all with Phil Dobbie.
You know, in a former life, I worked for the British Tourist Authority, or Visit Britain, as it's now called these days. It was when I was there, it was the 1990s, and lots of people did want to come to Britain on holiday. I actually moved to Australia to tell people how good it was in Britain, whilst going to the beach every weekend and enjoying endless days of sunshine and warm weather, while being paid by the British taxpayer to tell people, yeah, sure, it's great over there. Now, where have I put my swimmers? Now, of course, I'm back. I'm locked down, admittedly, in very beautiful countryside. We're all in the same boat, aren't we? Locked down, nowhere to go. It's been snowing all week. It's going to be where I am. It's going to be -7 tonight, apparently. And people, I think, are just a bit fed up. But, you know, it's soon going to be spring. It's not just the flowers that normally blossom in spring. The British people do too, don't they? And that's us. We come out of the darkness into long summer nights, pleasant temperatures, those pub beer gardens. Imagine that alternate universe. The sun shining, the beautiful countryside, and sitting there till late at night in the open air, enjoying everything that the British pub has to offer. Will we get that this year? Will anybody be able to come and enjoy those things from overseas? Well, this is how Visit Britain were promoting the UK last year. I'm not really quite sure the timing was very good, but this was an idea. This is the ad.
Escape to views you've missed.
Some beautiful shots of the UK.
All the places you've dreamed about.
Well, there's even someone trying to enjoy the beach there. Punting at Cambridge.
To eating out.
Ooh, that looks nice. Yeah.
Escape to a new perspective.
Museums there, riding horseback along empty beaches.
Not chores. To feeling free again.
Someone on a zip wire.
Escape the everyday.
Looks nice.
Take a UK break this autumn.
Yeah, not many listen to the advice to come here, of course. We don't have any official statistics. The last ones we've got is for March, up to March last year. But visitor numbers, even in March, just as it was all starting, less than half the year before. And obviously it went much lower as the pandemic went on. 41 million tourists we normally get, whittled down to what? I imagine a few million UK tourists, if that. And that would probably be people visiting people they know. And then, of course, this yesterday, what's this going to do for tourism? This from the ever charismatic Matt Hancock.
When they arrive, they'll be escorted to a designated hotel, which will be closed to guests who aren't quarantining for 10 days or for longer if they test positive for COVID-19 during their stay. People will need to remain in their rooms and, of course, will not be allowed to mix with other guests, and there'll be visible security in place to ensure compliance alongside necessary support. Any positive result will automatically undergo genomic sequencing to confirm whether they have a variant of concern. Third, Mr. Speaker, we'll be backing this new system with strong enforcement of both home quarantine and hotel quarantine. People who flout these rules are putting us all at risk. Anyone who lies on the passenger locator form and tries to conceal that they've been in a country on the red list in the 10 days before arrival here will face a prison sentence of up to 10 years.
10 years, yes. Come to Britain, it's great here. In fact, if you like it, well, you can stay for up to 10 years, which is about the length of time you get for manslaughter. So is it all justified? This is all this hotel quarantine stuff. Obviously, this is actually just for British residents returning from a red list country. Otherwise, people from those countries can't come at all. So at last, it seems that the UK is getting very serious about stopping international travellers, and all because they are very scared, clearly immensely scared about the various strains of the virus, particularly from South Africa. Because imagine if that became the predominant strain and the AstraZeneca vaccine is only 10% effective against it, as one small study has shown. Of course, in South Africa, they've stopped using the AstraZeneca virus for that very reason. If we get the AstraZeneca vaccine out and we find it's not really working, we are going back to square one, aren't we? So you can see the government's point. So maybe the revised campaign for Visit Britain, hastily put together, should be something that's really telling you to not come here at all.
Escape.
A prison sentence, 10 years.
To views you've missed.
Visible security in place to ensure compliance.
To all the places you've dreamed about.
10 years. Putting in place tough fines for people who don't comply.
To eating out.
In a designated hotel.
Escape.
Prison sentence.
To a new perspective.
For a quarantine package, £1,750.
Take a UK break.
For 10 days from the time of arrival.
Do you think that'll put them off? I think in this new authoritarian world, I think so. And I sort of get why we have to do this, why we have to have this quarantine. I just wish Matt Hancock didn't look as though he was enjoying playing Stalin quite so much. But maybe, we should run ads like that. Maybe get Visit Britain. It needs new objectives. They should become the office responsible for dissuading people from visiting Britain. We should just change the style of the ad. Show lingering shots of Hemel Hempstead, for example, and Slough. Maybe the voiceover could be John Betjeman writing about Slough. This is a poem from him in 1937, just before the war. Come, friendly bombs, and fall on Slough. It isn't fit for humans now. There isn't grass to graze a cow, swarm over death. It's not their fault they do not know the bird song from the radio. It's not their fault they often go to Maidenhead and talk of sport and makes of cars in various bogus Tudor bars and daren't look up and see the stars but belch instead. So, you see, Slough, clearly a bit of a dung heap even back then.
It's The Business with Phil Dobbie.
Making sense of it all.
By the way, a few comments and tweets about yesterday's show with people asking me why I was spooking Bitcoin, which I don't think I was. I mean, I'm steering well away from it, but Max Kaiser was definitely spooking him, which is why we got him on the program. And I did ask him why he thought the price would perpetually go up. You make your own decision about whether he was convincing or not. I asked him why also he hadn't cashed in any of his money. Perhaps I didn't make that point firm enough because it didn't gel with me. If you've got something which is perpetually going up, unless you are 100% convinced, and who is 100% convinced on anything? You would, if you had so much of it, you would surely cash out a proportion of it just to hedge your bets. And also I did suggest that he was talking it up, so others followed him. So, and right at the start also, I did point out that just as he was saying everyone was using Bitcoin to trade in Nigeria, the central bank there has banned it. So I'm not quite sure how much you take out of what came out of Max's mouth as complete truth. And, I also don't see how anything so scarce can ever become the predominant currency anywhere. That's why we got away from the gold standard. But I'm curious why Elon Musk, who is clearly pretty smart, has taken the double gamble of putting so much of it in the Tesla balance sheet when his share price is clearly overvalued. That is why I got Max on yesterday to try and explain it all, and I'm not sure many of us got any the wiser as a result of it. But if he did do a convincing job of getting you to buy Bitcoin, even though Max tells me it's actually very hard to get hold of, then blame him. Don't blame me. But we do, of course, the idea is we do want to investigate ideas on this podcast. So you may not agree with lots of them. In fact, I'm sure this podcast could be quite annoying to lots of you. Now, we are weeks away from the next budget. That should prove very interesting, shouldn't it? Remember last November when Rishi Sunak presented his spending review and painted a picture of just how much debt we are getting into, and that was before we knew how this year was going to shape up.
Mr. Speaker, the economic impact of coronavirus and the action we've taken in response means that there has been a significant but necessary increase in our borrowing and debt. The UK is forecast to borrow a total of £394 billion this year, equivalent to 19% of GDP. The highest recorded level of borrowing in our peacetime history. Borrowing falls to £164 billion next year, £105 billion in 22-23, then remains at around £100 billion, 4% of GDP, for the remainder of the forecast. High as these costs are, the cost of inaction would have been far higher. But this situation is clearly unsustainable over the medium term. We could only act in the way we have because we came into this crisis with strong public finances. And we have a responsibility, once the economy recovers, to return to a sustainable fiscal position.
There we go again, a fiscal position, sustainable fiscal position, which I presume he means get back to balancing the budget, even though that is just a distant memory. I mean, nobody has successfully done that since 2001, despite all those years of austerity. So, and he says we couldn't have done it without having the economy in such good shape. And yet, we had to borrow so much to get the NHS up to the task. So how can the economy have been in such good shape? If you are a fiscal conservative, how can it have been in such good shape after 19 years with a growing deficit and the slow growth that resulted from it? Look, Lord Razzle from the Lib Dems, I love that name, Lord Razzle from the Lib Dems, the Dim Libs. I think I almost said I don't think that's the case, but he put it all rather well, I thought, during the Lord's spending review. Well, it was the review of the spending review, the Lord's review of spending review, in early December. This is what he had to say.
The numbers are clear. At the end of October, government borrowing was just over £2 trillion. But what the Chancellor did not say is that just under 50%, i.e. nearly £900 billion, is actually owned by the Bank of England, with interest payments obviously recycled to the Treasury. And since the start of the pandemic, 50% of government bonds issued to fund expenditure have been bought by the Bank of England. Now, noble lords may think this is rather a lot, but it's nothing compared with what's happening elsewhere. In the same period, the European Central Bank has purchased 70% of bonds issued by European governments, and the Bank of Japan has purchased 75% of Japanese government debt issues. Now, Milton Friedman, that economist so beloved of the right wing of the Tory party, always said that such action by central banks was dangerous because it would lead to crowding out the private sector, resulting in a fall of bond prices and rising inflation. But this has just not happened this time. Despite the fears raised by the Chancellor yesterday, would the Minister accept the possibility that firstly, interest rates will remain low for the foreseeable future, secondly, that the market for the sale of gilt-edged securities to pension funds and insurance companies underpinned by Bank of England purchases will remain strong? If these conditions continue, will he accept it's just possible that the government can continue to borrow to fund necessary spending until the economy recovers without the need for damaging tax increases? What a bonanza that would be for all of us.
Well, let's hope that's what happens, Lords Razzle-Dazzle, because it would be tragic, wouldn't it, if Rishi Sunak did put up the taxes just because he is being channeled somehow by the late Milton Friedman, who is conveniently using death as a reason not to be called on to explain why his approach to fiscal conservatism hasn't been working all these years, although he would say, well, look, you've run a deficit for so long. That is your problem. You should have had more austerity. But if you were Rishi Sunak now, what would you be doing? What would you be putting in your budget? Because it looks like this lockdown is going to go on for a while longer yet. We are also seeing, of course, big changes to the structure of the economy, not least a widening wealth gap and public sector borrowing reaching extraordinary levels. The OBR forecast, the Office for Budget Responsibility, their forecast is $394 billion added to public sector debt from April last year to March this year. That will almost certainly be revised upwards. But Rishi Sunak has a budget to deliver early next month, March the 3rd. and he has been making noises for a long time that this spending can't go on forever. We just heard about him at the spending review last year. He's repeatedly talked about balancing the budget, although that does seem a million miles away, and it doesn't seem like the time to do it right now. Whilst in the US, the debate isn't about tax rises. In fact, far from it. It's about how much extra stimulus should be pumped into the economy. 1.9 trillion seems to be the going figure. But the question over there is, will that cause inflation? Well, Kallum Pickering, senior economist at Berenger, the investment bank, wrote for The Telegraph a week ago about how this is not the time to think about tax cuts. He joins us now. Just hard, though, isn't it, Kallum, for a Tory Chancellor to look at a public sector to GDP ratio that's exceeding 100%, particularly after years of austerity, and not feel the need to do something about it, to get spending down or tax up, anything to reduce that deficit?
Well, there are two questions which are just worth keeping in mind here. First, why are we spending and borrowing the money that we are? And second, in the context of a long history, do we actually have a lot of debt? We often hear big numbers thrown around, but what do they mean in context? And the first point is that we are borrowing to keep an economy in a state of suspended animation. And all of the underlying evidence from the labour market, from businesses, suggests that, yes, of course, there's some damage. This is a huge economic shock. But by and large, the underlying economy is being kept in a decent state of health, which means once we lift the lockdown, we can end the emergency spending, the borrowing will fall, and the economy will, in a way, sort of spring back to life. The second point about the actual level of debt, big numbers catch headlines, but whether or not they have any economic relevance is what really matters. So at the moment, the UK's public debt to GDP ratio is probably around 100%, and it seems like it would be a magic number, but really it's not. If you take a 300-year history in the UK, average public debt to GDP is around 100%. And, well, the other thing to keep in mind is that high level of debt actually causing the UK any problems? Well, interest rates are at a historic low. The interest payments that we pay on the debt stock are almost at a historic low. So this is a level of debt which is providing a very good use to keep the economy in shape, and we can handle it. I don't really see the urgency to suddenly panic about a problem which is actually not that significant.
Yeah, well, there is a danger. I mean, if he does panic, then he could turn things the other way, couldn't he? But if we look at the United States, I mean, they don't seem too concerned, do they? Perhaps being the reserve currency helps a little bit because people are always going to buy US treasuries. And, maybe that in the UK we have to be more careful because if people see that we are unilaterally spending big, then that could create a crisis of confidence. And that might hit the pound a little bit. But, of course, every country is in the same boat right now. So there's no reason for concern about confidence. And as I say, look at the United States. They are borrowing so much more.
Well, the US enjoys, you might call it an exorbitant privilege because it is the global reserve currency.
Yeah.
But, reality exists whether policymakers choose to acknowledge it or not. And the reality that you speak of is that markets are actually very, very relaxed about what governments are doing with their borrowing levels because they see the underlying benefits for the economy. There may well come a time when, looking at the balance of taxes versus spending, some adjustments need to be made, but in the middle of a crisis is not the time to make that assessment. I think there's very good reason to think that once the economy recovers, we get back to something like full employment, firms are producing at high capacity, people are spending as normal again. Most of that deficit will mainly self-correct. This is very different from the financial crisis when we headed into a crisis with unsustainable borrowing. The balance for the government was actually in okay shape heading into this crisis. And as a result, a period of very high short-term emergency borrowing is nothing to fear.
And of course, the interest rates are so low now that the borrowing costs are very, very low. So even if you were to fund over 30 years, if you were to put it into 30-year gilts, issue 30-year gilts, the interest rate is still low. And of course, allowing for inflationary costs, then it's going to come down in value. So you're actually paying back less at the end of it all. So, I mean, there's big opportunities for the government in all of this.
Well, it really depends on what you spend on. Keep in mind, if what we're doing is borrowing money just to plug in cash flow holes that companies have and to keep people in employment, that is debt that will stick with you forever. But if you think on a 3 or 4 or 5 year view, there are some good investment opportunities on the public side. We talk about the big infrastructure plan in the UK, upgrading the north of England. In economic terms, all of those investment projects have a positive real return. So they actually benefit the country over time. Whereas if you are just borrowing for inflation, so to get some idea of a real borrowing cost, that is negative. So the spread between investment and borrowing is very, very large. This is a unique opportunity in a way.
So do you think then, rather than talking about pushing up taxes and saying I've got to claw back this money, he really should be talking about spending big on infrastructure projects? This is an opportunity while spending costs are low, and we have obviously much higher unemployment as a result of all of this when we come out of it at the other end.
Yep. Structural
change. Say, well, okay, you had a job working in a restaurant, it's not there anymore. How about helping build this new green energy plant, or whatever it might be? I mean, whatever the examples are, an opportunity for the government to start spending big on infrastructure, which is going to future-proof the country.
The answer to that question is simply yes. And you listed things there, tackling climate change, greening the economy, helping workers, which will be shifted from essentially old parts of the economy, such as in-store retail, to more modern parts of the economy. We've all shifted online. But the point that is important here is there's a misconception about what we actually need to do once we accumulate debt. I think it's a misnomer that the UK in the past, or any advanced country for that matter, has actually paid off the debt it has accrued during a crisis. Typically what happens, and this is true with all the big debts through history, you can go back 200 years, you can look at the First World War, the Second World War. The debt that is accrued doesn't really fall. It's not as if we run taxes higher than spending for a period to pay back. What we generally do is just roll over the debts that we have and grow the economy so that debt as a percent of our income comes down. That is precisely what will happen this time around. And in that sense, the panic that we suddenly need to raise taxes to pay people back, this is basically ignorant of history.
So what about then this argument that we're hearing in some quarters in the United States that if you spend an extra $1.5 trillion, or 1.9 trillion, I should say, you're going to pump so much more new money into the economy that's going to cause inflation? Should we worry about that?
Yes, that is a risk to consider. Inflation is very, very damaging to economies. You don't want to erode the value of a currency. That's very different from the risks that could come from having excessive public debt. Of course, they interact. A faster rate of inflation usually means higher interest rates, and that's a problem for governments. But the inflation that you could get from excess spending is significant. But again, I don't want to sound too relaxed, but I think we're very far away from that.
Can you actually get it when you haven't got full employment? When you've got a lot of people unemployed, isn't that going to keep that inflation level down? Because it's hard, isn't it, to say, hey, look, I want a pay rise when there's so many people out of work.
That's exactly right. When you have a lot of spare capacity open, which we currently do across the advanced world, that is disinflationary, weighs on prices. And I think actually policymakers, perhaps not openly, but behind closed doors, will be happy about the fact that financial markets are now starting to consider whether there are any future inflation risks. And the thing that policymakers have in mind are the failures in the financial crisis, allowing a financial crisis to happen, not spending enough at the beginning of the recovery to escape the slow growth equilibrium that we suffered from. And keep in mind all of the political consequences of 10 years of weak economic growth. We see that across the Western world. So policymakers now are absolutely committed to reflating economies, and part and parcel of reflating economies is actually looking for signals of success. So if markets think, actually, are we doing too much? That is much better than in the middle of a crisis, markets panicking that we could be heading for a serious deflation. When interest rates are low, it's very easy to deal with inflation. You can just raise interest rates.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's Rishi Sunak. Has he read the manual in all of this? Because it's sounding like, okay, he made some noises about infrastructure investment in his spending review. But by and large, he seems to be saying, look, we've got over the bridge and now things are back on track. I want to get some of my money back.
Well, I think there's a little politics involved here. The UK economy is probably about 10% below its potential level at the moment. Just to give you a comparison, the hit to GDP in the financial crisis was 9%. So austerity today would be the equivalent of doing austerity in the middle of the financial crisis. That is obviously a bad idea. I do wonder if what we have is a little lip service towards budget prudence, but then actually when we look at the detail in the upcoming budget, we find that there are some commitments to investment spending. Any tax hikes which are announced probably don't come through until late this year, or at least next year when we're well clear of the pandemic. So it could be that a Conservative Chancellor is talking as if he's very disciplined on the budget, but actually underlying that, you see that the detail reveals he is going to stimulate the economy. Not to the extent that we see in the US, but I doubt that we will see austerity soon in the UK.
Right, and late next year, early next year, you think that's when the time that he could make that move? We're going to be clear of all the trouble by then. Do you think it's going to be that quick? I noticed Andrew Bailey, Governor of the Bank of England, said he expects the second half of this year we are going to see a bounce back because we've been vaccinated. Large parts of the population, of course, have got savings. They've not been spending all the money going to work and buying clothes to go to work and buying sandwiches at lunchtime, so they've been seeing their savings accounts rising at levels we've never seen before, because it costs a lot of money to go to work and earn money, doesn't it? So that money is going to get unleashed, presumably. He seems to think so anyway, and that's going to help with a fairly swift recovery. Is that the way you see it?
That is roughly the way I see it. Of course, there are lots of uncertainties when it comes to the virus, but just to finish, to give you a couple of numbers, the UK government has probably borrowed upwards of 300 billion to deal with its pandemic response, but roughly a number half of that level, so anywhere between, say, 125 billion and 150 billion, is excess savings which are now sat on household balance sheets where we've received income but we haven't been able to spend. The UK consumer generally, when it goes to the shops, really goes to the shops in a big way. So the Bank of England is now waiting for the economy to reopen, and that 125 billion that's on household balance sheet is spent. And just to give you a perspective, 125 billion is worth about 8% of an average year's consumption. So there's a lot of excess demand on the household side, which could feed through if we do successfully reopen.
So long as, when you talk about going to the shops, so long as there's some shops left, of course. We don't want everything to be online. Conversation for another day, though. Great to talk, Kallum. Let's hope we can get you back on again soon. Thanks.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Now, one thing we don't have time for today, maybe we could talk about this tomorrow. In Sydney, the bright, shining new casino that stands high on Sydney Harbour, viewed from just about all over the city, there were extraordinary planning regulations foregone to allow James Packer, who's the son of Kerry Packer. This is one of the wealthiest families in Australia, making their money mainly from publishing and television and gambling. They were allowed to build this casino, and at the time there were concerns raised. I was one of those people raising this concern that this would just be a hub for money laundering, a glittering tower, an icon to bad money, visible right across the city. And it would be somehow quite symbolic, actually, for Sydney that, they had a monument to the evils of how money is created in that city. Well, guess what? An inquiry into their operation has found them guilty of money laundering over a number of years, even before the casino opened, and they declared that Crown was unsuitable. This, the Packer company, was unsuitable to hold the licence in Sydney. It doesn't say anything about the licences they hold in other cities. The chair for this as well, by the way, for the Crown casinos, is Helen Coonan, who was a minister in John Howard's government when Australian politics really started to turn sour. So maybe more on that tomorrow. I don't know if we care what's happening over there. It may be corrupt. The politics may be a bit rubbish, but they are eating out and going to the beach and shopping, and they don't have to listen to Dr. Death giving press conferences at 5 o'clock every couple of days. So something to be said for it, isn't there? Now, that's it for today. I'll be back again tomorrow morning. See you then.
It's the Business with Phil Dobbie. Listen online at itsthedotbusiness or wherever good podcasts are found.